We were on the brink of reaching a milestone that had taken longer than I care to admit, and I remember standing near the towering glass windows of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, thinking how strange it was that success could feel so hollow. The city shimmered beneath the midnight sky, thousands of lights blinking like restless eyes, while inside the annual Winter Crest Foundation Gala unfolded in its usual parade of velvet gowns, polished shoes, and laughter that never quite reached the soul. I had spent the better part of the evening searching for my wife, Ilara, weaving through clusters of investors and philanthropists who congratulated me on finalizing the cross-continental acquisition that would soon triple the valuation of my family's logistics firm. For years we had worked toward this expansion, sacrificing weekends, postponing vacations, and convincing ourselves that shared ambition was the same thing as shared love. I carried the news like a wrapped gift, rehearsing how I would tell her that everything we had envisioned was finally within reach. But when I pushed open the carved mahogany doors leading to the private reading lounge, I found her wrapped in the arms of a man whose face I knew better than most of my own relatives. Dorian Hale, chief executive of our fiercest competitor, held her with a familiarity that could not be explained away by polite society. Her fingers clutched the back of his tuxedo jacket, and her expression was not one of strategy or negotiation, but of practiced intimacy. I stood there longer than I should have, absorbing the tableau in silence, feeling the strange transformation of heartbreak into something colder and far more precise. The music from the ballroom drifted in faintly, a distant orchestra underscoring the quiet collapse of a marriage I had believed unbreakable. I did not confront them. I did not clear my throat or demand an explanation that would insult us both. Instead, I stepped back into the corridor and allowed the door to close without a sound. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I passed beneath crystal chandeliers and smiling portraits of benefactors long dead. Several acquaintances called my name, eager to toast the acquisition they assumed I was celebrating, but I simply nodded and continued walking. My mind, trained by years of high-stakes negotiations, began assembling contingencies with frightening clarity. By the time I handed my valet ticket to a young attendant shivering in the night air, the shock had hardened into resolve. 15 years of marriage, built alongside the empire my grandfather had seeded with a modest shipping contract decades ago, had just revealed itself to be a facade constructed on my willingness to trust. As I drove through the sleeping streets toward the estate Ilara and I shared, I replayed the scene not with tears but with analysis. How long had it been happening? What information had she shared? Which internal reports had she accessed under the guise of executive oversight? The questions did not sting as much as I expected. Instead, they fueled a meticulous calm. Silence, I realized, would be my greatest advantage. She had always mistaken my measured temperament for weakness, teasing me in private for avoiding loud arguments or dramatic gestures. Tonight, that assumption would cost her more than any shouted accusation ever could. When I entered the house, the foyer lights flickered on automatically, illuminating marble floors and the sweeping staircase we once posed on for anniversary photographs. I bypassed the bedroom entirely and went straight to my study, a room lined with dark walnut shelves and the quiet hum of encrypted servers hidden behind antique globes. Inside a concealed compartment behind an oil painting hung the original partnership agreements, the amended shareholder contracts, and the prenuptial document Ilara herself had insisted upon before our wedding. She had claimed it was to protect her future inheritance from her father's estate, but I had recognized even then that she valued leverage above sentiment. I sat at my desk and began reviewing the clauses we had both signed nearly 7 years earlier, focusing on the infidelity provision that triggered an immediate forfeiture of executive privileges and unvested shares. Over the next several hours, I contacted our legal counsel through a secure channel, initiating procedures that would quietly remove her access to proprietary data and suspend her authority pending formal review. Digital signatures replaced handwritten ones. Automated alerts were scheduled to activate at dawn. I transferred discretionary funds into protected trusts and restructured voting rights within the board to consolidate decision-making power solely under my control. Each action was deliberate, executed without haste, yet without hesitation. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed a muted 3 in the morning, the foundation of her professional standing had already begun to erode. Her car's headlights swept across the curtains shortly thereafter, announcing her return. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and sat at the long stone island, watching the faint glow of the appliance display tick forward second by second. The front door opened, followed by the soft thud of heels being discarded and the low murmur of a tune she often hummed when pleased with herself. The scent of unfamiliar cologne preceded her entrance into the kitchen, sharp and unmistakably masculine. When she noticed me seated in the darkness, she startled, placing a hand against her chest as if I were the one trespassing. She asked why I was sitting there like a specter, her tone edged with irritation that thinly veiled apprehension. I studied her face, searching for remorse and finding only calculation. After a long pause, I told her I had left the gala shortly after seeing her in the reading lounge with Dorian. The words were delivered evenly, devoid of accusation. For a fleeting instant, confusion crossed her features before she assembled a smile that failed to reach her eyes. She claimed they had been discussing a potential merger, that I had misunderstood a strategic embrace. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as though she had anticipated discovery but not the manner of it. I did not argue. Instead, I rose, retrieved a leather portfolio from the counter and placed it before her. The documents inside outlined the suspension of her executive authority, effective immediately, pending a board review triggered under Clause 9 of our marital contract. The color drained from her face as she skimmed the pages, recognition dawning with each line of legal language. Her voice rose in disbelief, insisting that marriage entitled her to half of everything, that I could not simply sever her from the company we had built together. I reminded her gently that the company predated our union by nearly 2 decades, and that the controlling interest remained in my name due to the very agreement she once championed. The infidelity clause, clearly defined and notarized, did not require a public spectacle to activate. It required only evidence and intent, both of which I possessed in abundance. She attempted to pivot, to soften her tone, suggesting that Dorian's interest had been purely tactical, that she had played along to extract confidential insights for our benefit. The irony was almost admirable. While she postured in the arms of a rival, I had been finalizing a distribution deal that rendered his expansion strategy obsolete. I explained none of this. Instead, I informed her that her company accounts had been frozen and her access credentials revoked as of midnight. The board would be notified at opening bell. The estate itself, held in a separate trust, would be listed for sale within the month. For the first time since I had known her, genuine fear eclipsed her composure. The empire she believed she was leveraging had shifted beyond her reach in a single, silent evening. She accused me of cruelty, of orchestrating her downfall with premeditated malice. Perhaps there was some truth in that, though I preferred to think of it as self-preservation refined by necessity. Over the years, I had noticed subtle changes in her priorities. Confidential meetings she declined to elaborate on, late-night messages she shielded from view, an increasing fascination with our competitors' market maneuvers. I had attributed it to ambition, not betrayal. Now those fragments assembled into a coherent pattern. As dawn approached, I outlined the practical realities she would face. The severance outlined in the contract allowed her to retain personal belongings acquired prior to our marriage and a modest settlement calculated from her initial investment, adjusted for inflation. It was not destitution, but it was a far cry from the executive lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. She paced the kitchen, oscillating between indignation and pleading, yet I felt only an expanding stillness. The emotional storm I might once have unleashed had been replaced by strategic clarity. I told her she was free to pursue whatever future she envisioned, including one alongside Dorian, but it would be constructed without the scaffolding of my family's legacy. By mid-morning, the board convened an emergency session via encrypted conference. The evidence, compiled overnight, was sufficient to initiate formal removal proceedings under the governance bylaws. While the directors expressed shock, none challenged the legality of the measures. Our firm's stability mattered more than personal drama, and I ensured that narrative remained focused on protecting shareholder value. News traveled quickly within industry circles. By afternoon, Dorian's attempts to contact senior managers were met with polite refusals. The insider access he presumed through Alara had evaporated. I learned through indirect channels that his tone toward her shifted markedly once her authority dissolved. The alliance she believed transformative proved conditional at best. I did not celebrate this development. Instead, I redirected my attention toward consolidating new partnerships and reassuring long-term clients that continuity would prevail. The acquisition I had closed the previous evening moved forward seamlessly, insulated from scandal by the discretion of those involved. In the span of 24 hours, my marriage had fractured, yet the enterprise stood stronger than before, fortified by decisive leadership and the absence of divided loyalties. Returning to the estate that evening felt like walking through a museum of a former life. Portraits, awards, and carefully curated furniture pieces testified to years of curated appearances. Alara remained in the guest suite, making frantic calls that went unanswered more often than not. I felt no urge to engage further. Instead, I contacted a real estate broker to begin discreet valuations of the property and initiated inquiries into coastal residences several hours away from the city's relentless scrutiny. I realized that beyond legal safeguards and financial recalibrations, I needed physical distance from the architecture of betrayal. The house, magnificent as it was, carried echoes I no longer wished to inhabit. Over the following weeks, arrangements unfolded with methodical efficiency. The estate was listed privately. Offers emerged from investors eager to own a landmark property. I finalized the sale of several non-essential assets and redirected capital toward a diversification fund aimed at supporting emerging entrepreneurs from underserved regions, an initiative I had long postponed due to domestic distractions. In building something constructive from the wreckage, I discovered an unexpected sense of liberation. Alara attempted reconciliation once the full implications of her situation crystallized. She approached me one afternoon in the study, her voice subdued, asking whether we might reconsider, whether public counseling and a renewed commitment could repair what had been damaged. I listened without interruption, recognizing in her appeal not love but the dawning awareness of lost status. I told her calmly that forgiveness and restoration were separate matters, and while I harbored no desire for vengeance, I could not rebuild trust on the ruins of deception. The legal separation proceeded without spectacle, governed by the parameters she had once deemed prudent. When she finally departed the estate, escorted by movers tasked with inventorying her personal effects, I watched from the balcony with an emotion closer to closure than grief. The silence that followed was not oppressive but expansive, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. Several months later, settled into a modest yet sunlit home overlooking a quiet shoreline, I reflected on the night that altered my trajectory. The ocean air carried none of the stale ambition that had saturated gala ballrooms and board meetings. I spent mornings reviewing strategic plans and afternoons mentoring founders whose integrity outweighed their resources. The company achieved record performance that fiscal year, driven not by rivalry but by renewed focus. I occasionally heard fragments of news about Alara and Dorian, an aborted venture here, a strained partnership there, but I felt no compulsion to investigate. What lingered instead was the recognition that walking away in silence had preserved more than dignity. It had preserved autonomy. In choosing restraint over spectacle, I had redirected the narrative of my life away from reactive fury and toward deliberate intention. The question people often ask, whether I regret not confronting them publicly, misses the point entirely. The most decisive battles are often won without raised voices, in the quiet recalibration of power that occurs when one refuses to be diminished by betrayal. In the first winter after everything unraveled, I began to understand how deeply I had mistaken endurance for devotion. The shoreline outside my new home stretched wide and unpretentious, a band of silver water meeting pale sand that bore no memory of galas, rivals, or whispered humiliations. The house itself was modest compared to the estate I had sold. 2 floors of glass and cedar perched above a quiet harbor where fishing boats outnumbered yachts. Mornings started before sunrise, not because I had to impress investors on another continent, but because I wanted to watch the horizon ignite with color. I brewed my own coffee, answered only the messages that aligned with my priorities, and declined invitations that smelled of opportunism. The board quickly adapted to my recalibrated leadership style. I no longer delegated the cultural direction of the firm. I shaped it personally, emphasizing transparency, long-term value, and a zero-tolerance stance on ethical compromise. Employees who had once felt pressured by Elara's aggressive tactics seemed to breathe easier. Profit margins rose steadily, not in dramatic spikes but in sustainable increments that reassured stakeholders. The irony was unmistakable. Removing the one person who claimed to be indispensable strengthened the institution she once tried to leverage. In the quiet evenings, I reviewed expansion proposals while the tide rolled in, each wave a reminder that momentum need not be loud to be powerful. I realized that the silence I chose that night at the gala had not been weakness. It had been discipline, the kind forged over decades of watching markets fluctuate, and learning that reaction often benefits the opponent more than resolve ever could. Word of Elara's attempts to salvage her standing reached me indirectly through industry chatter. Dorian, deprived of the insider intelligence he had presumed permanent, pivoted quickly, aligning himself with a different consortium rumored to be exploring aggressive acquisitions. Their partnership, once whispered about as a power alliance, dissolved with minimal ceremony. She attempted to secure a leadership role at a boutique consultancy, but references proved difficult to obtain when the circumstances of her departure circulated discreetly among executive networks. I did not orchestrate these consequences. They unfolded naturally, the way reputations recalibrate when truth surfaces. Still, I would be dishonest if I claimed to feel nothing. There was a fleeting ache in knowing that the woman I once trusted with my vulnerabilities had reduced herself to transactional calculations. Yet that ache carried no venom. It resembled the soreness of a healed fracture, a reminder of injury rather than its continuation. I devoted increasing energy to the mentorship initiative I had quietly funded. We selected founders based not solely on projected returns, but on character assessments, interviewing them extensively about setbacks and ethical dilemmas they had faced. Watching their determination reignited something in me that had been dulled by years of social maneuvering. They were hungry, yes, but not predatory. Ambitious, yet not reckless. In guiding them, I found a reflection of the younger version of myself who once believed success and integrity could coexist without compromise. As spring approached, I encountered Elara unexpectedly at a maritime fundraiser in a neighboring town. The event was smaller than the galas we once dominated, its decor understated and its guest list modest. She looked different, less armored perhaps, though still composed. For a moment, our eyes met across the room, and I sensed a silent acknowledgement of shared history. She approached cautiously, asking whether we might speak outside where the sea breeze could carry away awkwardness. I agreed, not out of lingering attachment but out of curiosity about who she had become in the aftermath. She spoke of lessons learned, of misplaced ambition, of the illusion that proximity to power equates to security. There was sincerity in her tone, yet also a recognition that consequences cannot be undone by regret alone. I listened without interrupting, then told her I hoped she would build something authentic, even if it required starting from foundations far humbler than those she once occupied. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no rekindled spark, only two adults standing at the edge of cold water, acknowledging that choices define trajectories more than intentions ever will. When we parted, I felt no resurgence of pain. Instead, I experienced a quiet confirmation that closure does not require vindication. It requires acceptance. The company continued its steady ascent, entering markets we had once deemed too volatile. I approached these expansions with calculated patience, forming alliances rooted in shared governance standards rather than opportunistic gain. Investors noted the shift, describing our strategy as resilient rather than aggressive. Internally, I restructured executive compensation to reward collaborative performance over individual dominance, ensuring that no single figure could ever wield disproportionate influence without accountability. The memory of betrayal informed these decisions, but it did not consume them. It served as a blueprint for safeguards rather than a catalyst for paranoia. Meanwhile, my personal life evolved in understated ways. I rekindled friendships neglected during years of relentless ambition. Weekend sailing trips replaced networking brunches. Conversations centered on literature, travel, and philosophy instead of quarterly forecasts. For the first time in years, I felt multidimensional, no longer confined to the roles of husband or chief executive. Identity expanded beyond titles. I understood then that autonomy is not merely financial independence. It is the freedom to align daily actions with personal values without fear of hidden agendas. Looking back, the pivotal moment was not discovering Alara in Dorian's embrace. It was choosing how to respond. Had I confronted them publicly, the spectacle might have satisfied wounded pride but jeopardized the company's stability and my own composure. By walking away, I retained control of timing, information flow, and strategic execution. That choice reverberated far beyond the walls of the gala. It reshaped corporate governance, redirected philanthropic efforts, and redefined my understanding of partnership. I no longer equate love with shared ambition alone. Trust, I have learned, thrives not on grand gestures but on consistent transparency. As summer sunlight stretches long across the harbor and the sails drift lazily against the horizon, I sometimes consider how differently events might have unfolded had I reacted with fury instead of restraint. The image fades quickly, replaced by gratitude for the clarity that followed silence. My life now is not louder or more glamorous than before. It is steadier. And in that steadiness lies a fulfillment no gala applause could ever replicate.